Welcome to Female Athlete Stories, a special series of the Endurance Drive podcast. I'm Katie.
And I'm Elena.
And here we are, episode 5, is it?
We're at the end of our officially planned episodes, which is pretty exciting. And we have more coming, but we are now at the end of the ones that we were like, we need to definitely hit these 5.
I know, yeah, it was pretty bold of us to do that first episode and be like, they're coming, we're doing 5. And then we stuck to it, so I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, we followed through on our plan, which is any good endurance athletes, we did our training for it.
Exactly. So our last episode of this series, and again, this is not the end, but we are going to talk about how it makes us feel to be female athletes today. So we got some great content on that, and I'm excited to jump into it with you.
Yeah, this is a kind of more celebratory episode, I think, because it makes us feel really great, which is why we do it. Of course, there's some negative things that we'll talk about too, but yeah, this is just a fun one.
Okay. So let's jump right in because we have a couple topics here. I think the first thing we wanted to talk about with how it makes us feel to be a female athlete is like everybody said it makes them feel super strong and badass, which I love to see that.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, seriously, I think every forum at some point said the word badass, which I also think is more associated with the female athletes as opposed to men. I don't feel like people call men badass as much, but I did see a lot of badass.
Yeah. I wonder if it's like a gendered comment. Like, are people paying attention to women's asses? But
I don't know. I don't think it's like, I still think it's a positive thing. I just think it's reserved for women.
I like being called badass for sure.
Oh, yeah. It feels like more of a compliment than anything.
Totally. Well, if we drill into the badassery, we got a lot of different quotes that were recorded about different ways in which being a female athlete kind of impacts life and impacts how you see yourself as an athlete and a person. So the first one that came out a lot was people just having a lot more confidence in professional settings when they are a female athlete. So I'll read the first one. This quote says, "The confidence, mental fortitude, and belief in myself that has been gained from my athletic achievements helps me in other aspects of life, especially in work situations, meetings, and boardrooms." So I have this like image of this submitter just being badass and sitting in that boardroom and really commanding attention because of those skills that she's picked up from sport.
Yeah, I really love that one. I think that makes so much sense, and I can totally see how that woman feels in those situations. And the next one I also really like, and I'll read it first and then I'll share why I love it so much. But it says, "I believe that being a female athlete commands so much respect. I used to work for Kraft Heinz, and I was the only woman at my level in the entire beverage, snacks, and dessert division. I sit in with all men to address the CEO and CMO, also men. Every coworker at my level or above respected me as smart and tough in a very masculine culture. Gave senior leadership something to water cooler talk with me about while they joke with guys about their vodka flask at Disney World. I'll take sports talk over that any day," which is very funny. But my husband also used to work at Kraft Heinz, and when I saw this come in, I sent it to him immediately because we both understand what that culture. It's very, very masculine dominated, and totally loved that this woman really flipped that on its head by using her endurance confidence to level up with the guys.
Yeah, so if you're a female endurance athlete, you should probably go work at Kraft Heinz, and then you can flip the script on how things look. Last one that we'll read here says, "Through sport, I have developed so much confidence, grit, determination, and really fostered my drive. I've learned so much through sport. Example, being consistent, showing up daily, and taking small steps every day to reach a bigger goal, aka delayed gratification, that I have applied to my professional and academic lives. But truly, I feel I've become more diligent at work through seeing what I can accomplish through sport. It's instilled a huge amount of confidence in me and made me feel proud of my body and what I'm capable of." And actually that theme of capability came through a lot too. I think maybe women might lack a little bit of confidence in a lot of these male-dominated settings, understandably, because of the way that we tend to be treated. But if you're tackling these big goals in sport, I think you maybe have a little bit more space to say like, oh, I could also tackle some really big goals in other domains of life.
Yeah, definitely. It's a flywheel effect, and I've felt that myself, even just going on my very first, like I think back to going on a 5-mile run that felt like the longest run ever and realizing, wow, I could do that. So maybe I could go a little bit further, or trying one adventure and then, wow, I did that. Maybe I could do another one. And also seeing women who were already doing bigger adventures in those spaces and feeling like I could maybe do that too. So yeah, total flywheel effect. And once you have that skill set of like questioning what you can do and showing yourself you can do it, I think that applies to everything you do in life.
Do you think it goes back to, I wonder if like if you pick up these skills from sport and then you take them to work and then you do more things at sport, do you think it then translates back into sport?
I think it does. I think sport is powerful because it is a very tangible expression of achievement. Like you have very clear ways of setting a goal, working towards that goal, and evaluating whether or not you've hit your goal. Whereas in the rest of life, it can be a lot messier, more complicated, but there's still plenty of challenges that you can take on and show yourself you did that, or you got through that hard time, or you crushed that work presentation, or whatever it is. And totally it goes back to other things. It's really just, I think, showing yourself that when you take on a challenge that you can achieve it, and maybe setting more audacious goals and learning how to work back and figure out how to get there, which is a tremendous life skill set. And that's why I feel like I love endurance sports so much, because it's just like a constant practice ground for achieving other things in life.
It's interesting too. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think when we think about like doing really big or hard things in a professional or an academic setting, it's like, well, is this as hard as the time that I hiked 50 miles? Or is this as hard as doing an Ironman, or all these different things? And it's certainly a different type of hard, but like that grit to get through all that challenging stuff, I think probably does go both ways.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's why I also, if you remember when I was talking through my Black Canyon planning sheet, I have that one section that I called my cookie jar. That's like all of the hard things that I've overcome. And it's not just endurance things. It's some other things that I'm like, okay, well, if I got through that, can I do this? Or like, yeah, in the work setting, like I have to remind myself, well, I take one step after the other. And then in the new environment that I'm working on, what's the next step? Just do the next step, and just remind yourself that you can just do the next step. I think it's super translatable. And I remember my cross-country coach in high school first instilled that in me, where she said, just one step after the other, just take one step after the other, take the next step. And that was like a life lesson. And she knew she was giving us a life lesson, but she was hiding it into cross-country. And I was like, that is really smart. That's a great coach move right there.
Oh, that's such a great coach move. Yeah. And here you are still applying those principles to your life right now.
Yeah, exactly. It really pays off. I guess, Katie, the other question I would ask is how, from the flip side of that, I feel like I've experienced it being a little bit of a barrier in the professional setting too, just because as much as it gives me more confidence, which I apply to work, I also don't talk to my colleagues about how I'm thinking about it or why I am this way, because I'm not talking to them about my endurance endeavors as much, because it just feels so unrelatable. So do you like explicitly talk about that in your work environments, or how do you approach that?
I'm glad that you brought this up, because I have a very complicated way of thinking about sport in my academic context. And I think this actually struck me when I started my PhD program. So I came out to California and I met everyone in my cohort. And I realized that not very many people had hobbies other than political science. And it was like, that's work. That's not really a hobby. For me, it was the thing that I was doing work in. But whenever I talked about like, oh, I went for a cool bike ride this weekend, or I'm checking out some new trails that are near campus, I was sort of met with this blank stare that was like, you're doing something that's not political science, on the weekend or whatever. And it made me feel really self-conscious about the fact that I even did this, because it felt like there was this kind of competitive environment where if you weren't all in on the one thing that you were here to do, then maybe you weren't taking it seriously, or you weren't going to get as much work done. And so as a result, I think throughout my time, pursuing a PhD, I have really kind of tried to hide the more sporty angle of what I do, because it is something that doesn't come off as relatable. And I think people have then been surprised if they've found out, maybe they then follow me on social media, or they learn something about what I've done. They've been surprised to hear oh, I really spend a lot of time doing this because it's something that I don't talk a lot about, because I feel judged when I talk about it. So it's like, yes, those skills help me, but they do so very subconsciously, rather than me walking around with my Ironman finisher t-shirt. I definitely am not doing that.
Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. I feel like that's a challenge though, where it's like, ideally, of course, you want to show up in a work environment and, they say be your whole self and talk about all your different things. But at least in my more formal corporate environments, I've never found that talking about my endurance pursuits is really that helpful to me. It might help me connect with a few people who also are maybe runners, but it sometimes feels more isolating because I don't find it as relatable. And I just try to convey the lessons I've learned through sport in much more amorphous ways, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, because you can get a variety of different reactions, right? You can get the you're crazy, you're training for a 100-mile race. That's insane. Why would you ever do that? That's pretty common. Or you can get the oh my gosh, you're so amazing. I wish I could be like you, which kind of feels awkward too. I don't love that very much.
Exactly. I mean, you're nailing it. Those are the two main things that I find it really hard to navigate, because the 100-mile race does feel so foreign to so many people. I think spending so much time in the space, we normalize it to ourselves, but it's really not normalized in the broader context. So I think that is one thing that's been hard, where people are like, that it's totally crazy, or just want to immediately write me off as being unrelatable, when really I want to be able to emphasize to everyone that, like, honestly, I just made choices to train and to pursue this. But I fully believe that anyone who is starting running for the first time, they would have a similar progression to be able to achieve more than they ever thought they could achieve if they set their mind to it. And that's really the attitude I want to convey to people. But it feels like a non-starter sometimes if people kind of see the end goal but don't consider all the work that it took to get there.
Mm-hmm. And it's something that you should be proud of. Like, you should own it that you do really long races, and I should probably own it that I like to race Ironmans and all this different stuff. But it is something that I don't think is necessarily rewarded if you are a woman athlete. And if we bring back in this gender lens, I don't know that men are always maybe judged in the same way. It's more just like, oh, that's really cool. That's awesome if there's men that are pursuing this stuff. Whereas I think women, it's a little bit more foreign and thus met with some more uncomfortable reactions.
Yeah, just a tricky thing I think about, where it's like obviously so empowering to feel as confident and badass when you're going after your job. I've just also found that it can make me feel a little bit more guarded when I'm in professional settings too.
That's the perfect word. Yeah, it is a guarded thing to talk about. Well, I think this just speaks to like when you can spend time with more endurance athletes who are like, oh, cool, 100 miles. Like, yeah, I've got one in 3 weeks. That's awesome. What race are you doing? What's your favorite fueling source?
Yeah, being in the communities, it's always so refreshing when I go hang out with other trail runners and with the whole run, and you're talking about like, yeah, the specific fuel you're using and different gear, and you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot that there's people that also like are in this world, and I can learn from these people that are focusing on these same things instead of me just doing it on my own. So
totally, I love that. Well, actually, let's move out of the professional domain. We also got a quote that I absolutely love about just like how sport teaches you to feel strong in other domains of life. So someone said that what they find rewarding about being a female athlete is being in tune with my strength. As a mother, it's provided me with the structure I need to care for myself and to be a good example for my kids, which this was just so awesome. And I love envisioning this mom, like, going out for her run or her bike ride, whatever it is, and her kids being like, I want to do that when I grow up, and just having this idea that they can really do anything because they have this role model. And then similarly, she's taking care of herself by getting to continue pursuing this.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And I definitely want to be that kind of mom. I think we both aspire to be that kind of mom. It just made me think of, it's kind of sappy, but my husband did put this in our vows and I hadn't thought of it before, but he said something like, I feel comforted by the fact that our kids will grow up knowing that they can be and do anything they want because they see their mom doing it every day. And I think that was just a really special perspective to remind ourselves for Katie and I, when we are mothers, or to the moms out there, that by doing more of this stuff, you're also showing your kids that they can go out and do this kind of stuff, or just challenge themselves and be more than, just their mom. You're doing more than that. And on that vein too, another sadder perspective, but a really powerful one, I saw recently the Banff Film Festival, which is a great film festival. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in the outdoors world or just really beautiful cinematography. It comes through different cities, so maybe look up if it's coming to a place near you. But I went there very recently, and there was a really powerful film that had Hillary Nelson speak in it. She was a female ski mountaineer who sadly passed away in the fall of 2022 in a mountain accident. But she was talking about how she thinks about risk and pursuing these big objectives as a mom, and how she speaks very openly with her kids about risk and what she's doing. And she wouldn't trade what she's doing for anything because her kids see her as their mom plus so much more, a mom pursuing her greatest passion, a mom pushing the boundaries, and a mom trying to be as in tune with her life as possible. And I thought that was really powerful. So yeah, just really cool to think about moms really crushing it out there and being a good example to their kids, and how that might spread through the world slowly over time.
Yeah, and I love both those stories. And also, like, way to go, Will. That's a really good thing to include in the vows.
Yeah, it was sweet.
But I think also just thinking about how maybe traditionally it's been assumed that, like, once you're a mother, that is your sole purpose and there's nothing else. We've talked about this and talking about balance, and we'll probably revisit the idea of just kind of feeling selfish sometimes when pursuing these things. But I think these quotes show us, like, actually, this is an avenue to maybe even be the best version of yourself, and the best mother that you can be is still getting to do this and not being like, well, I'm going to give up every single thing that makes me me or that makes me whole to like only focus on child rearing. I think there's space to hold for continuing to really pursue this stuff. And that gives me a lot of hope for us as moms still crushing it.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe there's some reshifting of the buckets and prioritization, but it doesn't mean that it goes away entirely.
Was it the pendulum example? Yeah, the pendulum swing.
Yeah, there was a quote that said moving stuff around from the half-ass to badass spectrum.
Exactly. Yep. I have one. This is just a very quick anecdote. I was driving in Vermont a couple of weeks ago, and I guess this was probably in the fall because there was not snow on the ground, but I saw this couple. There was a mom pushing a jogging stroller and her husband was with her, and they were running up Bragg Hill, which if you're from the Upper Valley in New Hampshire, Vermont, maybe some of our audience is a really big hill, like a big, big, steep dirt climb. And the mom is pushing the jogging stroller. She is barely breaking a sweat, like coasting up this hill. And the dad's like lagging behind, like probably at threshold heart rate trying to survive this thing. And I was like, I could see that. Like that could be me. I think I want to do that. So shout out to the mom with the stroller on Bragg Hill.
So awesome. Yeah. I'm going to be that mom, though. I'm going to be pushing around
I will be with you. It'll be great. All right, segue right now. Something else that came out of kind of how it makes us feel to be female athletes was actually talking a lot about mental health benefits. And I think we want to really caveat this section by saying that mental health benefits from, endurance sports are not specific to female athletes or females in general. But I think there were some quotes that stood out to us. So the first one that I'll read says, again, talking about a reward of being a female athlete, the mental and physical strength it provides me, which translates to sanity, pride, and resilience. When I feel like all things in my life are swirling, when my mental health is on the total brink, and it has been a lot this year, I find that focusing on what my body is able to do and the gratitude and power I feel from doing it is what keeps me going. Being a female or woman athlete is about both survival and growth. So this one was really powerful, and I think I can relate to this too. Like often when I'm having a tough time, a trail run or just time outside is something that can really, really help. And I love to be able to just kind of pull that out and say like, okay, I need some space. I need some time in nature. I'm going to do this. And I usually do come out of it feeling a little bit better.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I agree where I think one thing that's special about endurance athletics is that usually, I mean, not always, but usually it includes being outside. Like you're running outside, you're biking outside. Maybe you're doing open water swimming. Maybe you're in a pool, which is maybe less outside. But I grew up as a ice hockey player and I was in rinks, and that felt very different to me than being able to be outside. And I think so much of why I love doing endurance sports is because it gives me a reason to get outside every day. And even if it's like not nice out, it's still just a great thing to be out in nature. And that also clearly has an effect on mental health. So I totally get what this person's saying. We got another quote that was just very simple and similar where it says, I just love the stress relief that comes from workouts as someone that can get anxiety. And yeah, if you're feeling anxious, I think it's been shown time and time again that being outside and exercise can help alleviate that to a certain extent. Of course, it's not like a silver bullet. And if you're already really active, I don't know if there's much more marginal gains to doing it more and more, but I think it's a good baseline activity for sure for helping relieve some anxiety.
Yeah. And talking about the mental health side, it gets really tricky. And we are very much not experts in this, but thinking about like mental health conditions that are more common in athlete populations, things like eating disorders, things related to body image, sometimes that can get wrapped up in more overtraining and sort of overdoing it on the endurance sports. But I think if we kind of ground in what it is about this type of movement that can actually be really helpful, for me, it's similar. Like it is absolutely being outside. It's not going to help me if I'm not feeling good and I go for a treadmill run, or if I go for a pool swim, like I will end up worse. I will probably quit 5 minutes into it. But if I can get outside and just like have that nature space, I think that's what stands out to me. But outside is not just going to do it for you alone. I think we've just found that that can be something to add to your toolbox for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm with you. Treadmill running is, I think, the worst thing ever. So
I think it's bad for mental health. That would be my hypothesis.
Yeah, it definitely seems bad for mental health. I've seen people who set up like their like pain cave environments. It's like, I think maybe you could turn that around and make it really fun for you, and more power to you. That's awesome. But I just need to be outside. I'd much rather any day go for a run in a horrible blizzard than I would get on the treadmill.
You and your yak tracks, right?
Yeah, except the trails are melting here. I'm not actually melting. The snow is melting and it's causing the trails to be all muddy. And I literally had a yak track swallowed by the mud this week.
Oh,
yeah.
No.
I actually had them both swallowed by the mud, and I didn't even realize it because it was that muddy. I just was slopping along, and then I looked down and realized that they weren't on my shoes anymore. And then on the way down, I was looking for them and I found one of them, but one of them is lost forever. It seems, because I've tried to find it 3 more times.
Oh, sounds awful. Maybe someday our podcast will take off and we'll get sponsored by Yak Tracks and we can have free Yak Tracks forever for us and all of our listeners.
That would be great. I've also been laughing because I keep commenting that I have my one Yak Track, and Yak Tracks usually has an X, and so I'm making it singular, and I'm like, is that correct? Like,
it's definitely correct. A single Yak Track. That just makes the whole thing sadder, honestly.
It's so sad. So it's okay. I'll go to Costco and I'll get another pair, and I don't think they're too expensive, but.
Yeah. And the subtitle of this episode is Elena's Yak Track.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I know.
All right, back to our content.
Yeah.
So last one that we want to mention here was people mentioned that a couple people brought up the idea that in female athlete circles, there's a greater acknowledgement that emotional stress is real stress and can have a huge impact on training. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective to bring into the female athlete space because, again, emotional stress that men and women experience is definitely going to impact training. I think we know that stress is stress, and your body actually interprets emotional or mental stress in the same way that it would interpret physical stress and has like tough downstream effects. But I think maybe in these female athlete communities, there's more open conversations about this type of stress. And I've certainly experienced that can be a really supportive environment for talking through things that are contributing to emotional stress and then making that connection.
Definitely. And I think, it ties in super closely with the community and sport episode, where I think it has been shown that isolation is one of the key factors leading to mental health concerns. And for female athlete communities, they seem to be so strong. And if you're going out and doing these activities with other people that are supportive and that are, acknowledging that emotional stress is real stress and you're able to talk about that, then it's just that much more powerful. So yeah, it's seemingly having a huge effect in the female athlete communities.
Yeah. So we love that. And again, really want to caveat that if you're having mental health challenges, it's not just going to be talking through it with other female athletes and or movement. Like definitely get some professional help, and we can link some resources in the show notes. But yeah, we really appreciate all these perspectives. Actually, to riff on that, we did get one perspective that I think is really important to engage with here is the fact that a lot of what we talked about specifically in this episode may or may not directly apply to gender. So someone said, I have a neutral to negative relationship with a female body and find nothing rewarding about being a woman athlete specifically. But as someone who didn't do sports until after college, I get a lot of joy and empowerment of thinking of myself now as an athlete, gender aside. Being able to bike 100 miles with less than a day's notice, the reward of seeing myself get stronger each year, the satisfaction of improving my cornering and feeling awesome going downhill, getting to meet people and friends just by showing up and biking. So I think this is super valid, and I totally understand that maybe some people don't actually feel that specific affinity to a female athlete community. I think maybe my experience on the flip side has been more that when we talk about the challenges that female athletes face or the forces that we're up against in the last episode, I think that's where maybe there's this little extra boost that we get from that community. But I'm curious, Elena, for your take on why this is special versus not in the female athlete space.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like it's coming back to the confidence point where no matter what, I think showing yourself like this person wrote, by being able to bike 100 miles with less than a day's notice, or showing yourself that you can do these things is so confidence building. And I think maybe from the female side is just that there are more instances where the confidence can get a little bit more pulled down. And that's not just females. I think it's any minority. So it's just another opportunity where it's maybe stronger for minority groups to show those confidence gains because they're not necessarily getting it from other places. But it doesn't mean that it's not true across the board. It just might have a stronger effect or lead to these stronger communities who are bonding over these kinds of activities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this brings us back to this conversation that we had about race in an earlier episode, that anytime there are going to be minority groups that are sectioned off from this skinny white man group that we've talked about, there's going to be these different pros and cons and challenges. And I also really like that this person talked about having a neutral to negative relationship with having a female body. So if we go back to our episode on the female body, that was our second episode, there are some things that are objectively more challenging for females to deal with than males, such as these fluctuations in the menstrual cycle can be sort of frustrating and can leave you feeling worse at different times, or dealing with boobs in sports bras, that can be difficult and challenging. And so in general, I think we're not going to stand here and be like, everything's so amazing about being a female athlete and it's so much better. There are some serious negative things that we could think about. And, at the end of the day, we're sort of just dealt the hand that we're dealt. And I think we make the best of it. But we're glad to have a perspective like this because it is a little bit different from the others that we received.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think I also relate to it from just feeling like how you present yourself as an athlete. I remember being younger and being surrounded by a male athlete environment and wanting to just be an athlete and not be recognized as a female athlete, but just as an athlete and be taken seriously in that space. And I think that's yet another way that this might show up. So really appreciated getting this perspective.
Cool. Well, now segueing into, we talked about some good feelings. We talked about being strong and badass. I think we also did want to talk about some of the more negative feelings that come up in the female athlete space. And one that really shined through was this sort of broad and hard to define sense of just feeling like you're not really measuring up. So this can take a couple different angles, but one of them was the idea of comparison. So someone said, it's really hard to navigate comparing myself to others, not doing the most intense or challenging thing and letting that diminish my own accomplishments. And I really related to this one. I think it's really hard when like we all have Strava and we can all see like, what was everyone's pace? What was everyone's heart rate? What were they doing? Like, what were their workouts like? How much do they train? Because it is really easy to play the comparison game. And we've talked about the comparison game like time and time again with whether it's body image or, you know, we talked about it in the context of pregnancy. We talked about it a lot. And I think it's really hard when some of those metrics for comparison can just be right in your face all the time, even with your friends and people that you really like and care about.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think that's one thing to really explore. So, Katie, I'm really curious to hear how you have navigated your relationship to Strava or other tools where you've been able to compare to yourself or to others.
Yeah, well, funny you mentioned this because I love Strava. I've been on Strava a lot. But actually, just in the last couple of weeks, I've taken a little bit of a break from Strava. We've talked about this briefly, but I've been going through some health stuff recently. And, you know, I just haven't really felt like my training has been where it has been in the past. And I know that there's an ebb and flow, and I know that that's okay. But sometimes it's just not that helpful for me to see all the time, like, well, my pace is lower, or my heart rate is higher than it used to be. And I found that as soon as I just stopped putting it on Strava, and actually I stopped recording some of my stuff, so I wasn't even really tracking on my watch. I was just going for a run. It really changed my whole narrative where I was like, I don't really know what pace I'm going, but I'm having fun and this is super beautiful. And a few days of that kind of made me feel ready to jump back in. But it was a good lesson. And I think it's really good to have breaks every so often from Strava and remind yourself why you're doing it and remind yourself what matters. At the end of the day, when you're navigating like really stressful times or different issues, you should maybe bring movement back into this. Like, I just need to be here for my mental health type thing rather than I need to hit the perfect workouts and have the lowest heart rate and the highest pace and all this different stuff. I think instead it's more just about like, why am I here? And so taking that break was really helpful for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like it reminds me a lot of the Instagram or social media debate. I mean, so Strava is social media. It just happens to be the most favorited social media for endurance people. But similarly, Instagram is obviously an incredible tool, and people use it for many different things, from business to connecting with friends and visually and other things. But people have to also have a healthy relationship with it, and that can take time and effort to develop. And I think the same thing with Strava. It could take time and effort to develop. And if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't have to work for you. And if you love it, that's great. So it can be tricky to balance the competitive aspect of it. And I actually once was lucky enough to be able to ask one of the co-founders about that. Mark Gainey had come to one of my classes, and I was asking, I'm a Strava fan, obviously. So I was like, oh my gosh, if the co-founder of Strava is here, I have to go talk to him. And I was genuinely really curious about this from a product development perspective of how do you think about developing this product that clearly can have some mental health concerns for people that are being hyper-competitive on it. And it's also self-selecting to have a lot of hyper-competitive people using the tool. And he was definitely aware of it. And I think I really loved talking to him because he had a good perspective on it. So they have a whole team that was focusing on this. And that was actually one of the reasons they introduced photos and video as one of the features, if you remember that, mainly because they knew that they wanted to make it about community and experience and try to limit a little bit of the competitive vibe of the app. And they immediately saw huge jumps. When they introduced photos, they saw huge jumps in the number of kudos that were given across the entire platform, because it was similar to Instagram where people were like, oh my gosh, that's a beautiful sunrise. I'm going to like that. Like, it just brought more engagement to the app overall, and it was more experiential than for the actual just pace and splits and more competitive aspects of it, which I thought was a really interesting product development.
That is really interesting. Yeah. And I would say actually, this is striking me that I think in general, Strava is probably more known for these experiential photos, whereas I think I see on Instagram more of these body focused photos. Certainly there are exceptions. You know, people are going to put nature on Instagram and people are going to put body photos on Strava. But at the end of the day, I think scrolling through my feed, it's like, oh my gosh, that's an awesome trail run that someone did. And look at that beautiful view. And I think that definitely makes me want to kudo someone. So I stand by that. I'm way more likely to kudo like a pretty photo on a short little zone 2 run for someone than something longer that's just morning run, dry, no photos attached.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really cool. Well, I guess the other question would be, how do you think about comparing yourself to your past self? Like that's been something that Strava added recently where I was like, this is interesting. They're showing me what I did 1 year ago today or 2 years ago today.
That was an interesting feature that I have very mixed attitudes on. When I feel good about where I'm at, and again, it is probably not a surprise to anyone on this podcast that I can be relatively critical of myself, and I'm certainly working on that. But whenever I'm feeling not great about where my fitness is at or whatever, it's hard for me to see like, oh, wow, I really crushed it a year ago on this day, was doing something super cool. So that part I don't like. But I also do like going back and being like, oh, I forgot about that cool thing that I did. We train enough that I think it's probably really easy to forget that random sunrise run that you did a year ago. That was like pretty, but nothing out of the ordinary. And getting to remember that I think is cool. But on net, I would say the tendency to compare it to yourself is sometimes a little bit counterproductive for me.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I have worked at being much better at my self-comparison because I am still on a trajectory right now, at least where I hope to be slowly getting better over time. But my journey has just had so many ups and downs along the way because of different life stressors and also just how training works, I think. And I fully recognize that where I am now might not be where I was before. And if you look at my, I don't know if it's really that great of a tool. Like, I don't think it's the end all be all, but the Strava, the fitness tracker that tracks your little number of your overall fitness. I have a total roller coaster of a graph where there's big troughs and big valleys, but it's like slowly trending upward over time. And for example, I had a workout this week that was objectively slower than a workout I had 2 months ago. And I feel way better about that workout this week than I felt about it 2 months ago, just because of like what I was dealing with and also like how consistent I was with it and for other factors. And I have just found that I don't put too much stock in where I've been. I think it bothers me sometimes, but then I remind myself that your fitness isn't meant to be at its peak all the time. Like, there's meant to be seasons, and there's different things you can focus on, whether that be speed or endurance or strength, or, maybe you're biking one season and you're running the next or something like that. So yeah, I really like the feature overall because I get to see the adventures I do. And sometimes when it shows me something that I did a year or two ago where it was really fast, I'm like, wow, I was in really good shape then. Like, I wonder how I got there. Maybe I'll get back there again. And it's more motivating, but it's definitely a mindset shift.
I like that. Well, I'm going to try to reframe a little bit. And I think, honestly, it's just bad timing that we're doing this right now because I'm like, oh, I'm annoyed at Strava. Like, it's a bad week. But I am also confident that, like, that's going to swing around and there's literally an ebb and flow to pretty much everything. So, sometimes that reminder can be really fun.
Oh, that's so real, too. You can catch yourself at just, like, a bad time. And, our emotions are all over the place anyways. So how you're feeling now might not be how you feel the next week.
Yeah. And it's interesting. This is just a sidebar on this whole process of podcasting. I feel like it's really interesting to think about our lens for thinking about pretty much everything we discuss. We try to really bring in the quotes from our form submitters and then kind of interweave our own perspectives. But it is tough, like, based on what you are going through in life right now and then figuring out that balance. It's been interesting to navigate that because I think we're pretty new to this podcasting space, but we will take feedback. So if anyone thinks we're not doing a good job, like, definitely let us know.
Yeah, we'll gladly take feedback and try not to be too critical of ourselves.
We would like compliment sandwiches. Like, you could sandwich in between.
I love that. Yeah, please give us a compliment sandwich.
Yes, but be assertive. Back to our last topic.
Oh, okay. With that, I feel like we should move into our last bucket, which is just the general feeling of being less worthy. There was a couple good quotes on this. The first is, a big challenge for me as a high school soccer player was feeling like the boys' team at my school received much more attention. For example, one year our team won soccer sectionals with very little fanfare, whereas the football team was merely competing in sectionals and later lost, and the whole school was decorated and we had a pep rally. It was also fairly evident that there was far fewer fans at our games than at the boys' soccer games. Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably just survey high schoolers across the nation, and this might be a common experience. At least I remember this really being true for me in high school. Our lacrosse team, we went to the state finals, and we had to beg the athletic director to say anything about it when there was like tweets going out every week for football just playing a game. So yeah, it is a little bit tricky. And I think, Katie, my question about this that I want to think more about is like, how does being taken less seriously or feeling less worthy translate into how we treat ourselves as endurance athletes?
That's a great question. And I like this quote because I think it brought me back to high school where I was not a very serious athlete in high school. I had just kind of started cross country and was on the bench for soccer. But I remember our football team did get a ton of attention. We were like average, it was a fine football team. But in my head, I was like, no, that makes sense. Like, it's the football team. It's the most important sport. And inherently, football is not actually the most important sport. But I think American culture has created that vibe. And it's not surprising that that would probably lead young female athletes to be like, well, I'm not as important as the men's sports, or there's something inherently different about my sport from their sport just because of the intention that's focused on it. And I think that can probably translate downstream into like imposter syndrome, both in sport and in life, and all these other really challenging underdog mentalities that can sometimes, I think, be pretty negative for female athletes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that about the American culture with football, because it totally is just the American culture that we are obsessed with the football. But then I think like for other sports, would it be a similar story? And I mean, we know that so many girls drop out of any kind of athletics around puberty, mainly because of discomfort with body image and just changing bodies in general, where, they're just less comfortable and there's no one really pushing them into sport because this doesn't seem socially and culturally like the thing for girls to do, as opposed to boys being kind of encouraged to go that direction. But I do think that your point on it being an underdog mentality is really interesting. And I feel like you can look at that in both the positive and negative lens, like we do so often here. And there's like a lot of nuance there. Yeah, nuance. But the underdog mentality, I think, is so powerful in many ways because it can really drive you to like be inspired and work really hard and go after those goals. But at the same time, it can leave you feeling like an outsider and feeling like you don't belong, and therefore maybe struggling with some other things. Like, at least for me, I think that's where a lot of my feelings of it being like a selfish pursuit come from, because I'm trying to, go spend so much time, effort, and energy to achieve these goals where I feel like an underdog. But is that a selfish thing to do? Is that like an unworthy way to spend my time because I don't belong in the space anyways? I think that's an interesting debate.
Yeah, I think if you have the feeling that you shouldn't be there in the first place, it's really easy to feel selfish if you put yourself there and if you shoot for these goals. And especially if you try to kind of move yourself out of this secondary or underdog space, then it's natural that it would feel selfish. And I think we probably could have a whole episode just on how we can work against those feelings, because they're so strong, I think, for so many people. And I think this transcends sports. It's not just endurance sports. I think this is very, very common in team sports. I think it's probably common for professional athletes. I think we know that there's some serious inequities. Like there was that headline that came out about the differences in facilities for, I think it was it NBA versus WNBA players or something like that? Yeah. Where all these signals are telling women that they don't belong or are not as worthy as men are. And so it would only make sense that this just totally messes with you, and it can lead to those, like the self-doubt, the imposter syndrome, the underdog mentality, the feelings of selfishness. I think the list goes on and on.
Yeah, definitely. It reminded me of a scene from The Sex Life of College Girls. If you guys, anyone,
great show.
That. Great show. I love that show. I was really not expecting to love that show, and I really love that show. But yeah, I remember one of the characters does like an expose on the differences between the male sports environments and the female sports, what they were given as different perks in their locker rooms and stuff like that. And I think that was just a pop culture representation of a very common experience.
Totally. I think we made it to the end of our list, did we?
I think we crushed it. Yeah, there's, the main quotes we wanted to pull on. So yeah, we are now officially through all of the information that came through in our form, trying to group it into these 5 episodes. So thanks for bearing with us.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone who submitted. It was really awesome. I think we had so much fun reading through everything that we got, and we hope to get more stuff to kind of sketch out our next several episodes. But I think we'll probably weave in a bunch of guests. So we have a lot of people that we want to interview that can provide kind of a new or fresh perspective on a lot of the themes that we talked about. We will do some deep dives on topics that we've maybe alluded to and topics we have not even dreamed up yet. But I think the biggest thing is we really get a lot of joy and inspiration from our community. So we want to hear from you on things that you want us to talk about or kind of riff on, because they have opened our eyes. And I think we have different perspective, but some complementary ones. So the more that we can get, the better.
Yeah, exactly. And we're so grateful for all the engagement. It's been really awesome. And like Katie mentioned, we are new to the whole podcasting thing. So it's also been really fun to learn how to start going through some of these responses and weave in our own stories, and definitely open for feedback on that too. And I think it'll only get better. So excited to keep exploring some of these stories.
Totally. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for listening. We will be back next week, I think, with an interview. It's going to be a lot of fun with a surprise guest. So stay tuned. We can't wait to put it out. And thank you so much for listening.